Close your eyes and imagine walking through ancient Rome in 67 AD. The marble corridors echo with whispered secrets as Emperor Nero glides past in his purple toga, torchlight casting dancing shadows. Beside him moves a figure of otherworldly beauty, a young woman draped in silk and jewels, moving with practiced grace. Then you hear the whispers. That's not a woman. Once he was called Sporus, the emperor. What he did to that boy. Your blood freezes as the truth sinks in. That breathtaking creature was once a 14-year-old boy named Sporus. What Nero did to transform him represents one of history's most calculated acts of psychological and physical destruction. This isn't just another tale of Roman excess. This is how absolute power transformed love into obsession, grief into madness, and a human being into a living doll created to serve one man's twisted fantasy. Before we descend into this darkness, understand that Sporus's story deserves remembrance, not as curiosity, but as testament to both human cruelty and the indomitable spirit that refuses to be completely broken. Picture 16-year-old Nero ascending to power in 54 AD. Handsome, charismatic, seemingly benevolent, he promised a golden age. Early years showed unprecedented generosity/taxes, spectacular games, support for arts. Citizens adored this emperor who walked among them, sharing their pleasures. But absolute power corrupts completely. Behind the facade, something sinister brewed. In 59 AD, just 5 years into his reign, Nero arranged his mother Agrippina's assassination, the woman who had orchestrated his rise to power. He tricked her onto a collapsing ship. When she survived and swam to shore, assassins finished the job. This matricide marked his descent into madness. With his mother's death, he eliminated the last check on his power. The Senate grew terrified. The Praetorian Guard looked away as his behavior became erratic. By 65 AD, paranoia consumed him. The real Pisonian conspiracy triggered characteristic excess. He executed not just conspirators, but anyone who might have known, creating court-wide terror. He began demanding worship, insisting he was Apollo's earthly incarnation, treating theatrical performances as divine manifestations. Isolation warped his reality. Surrounded by people who must agree with everything, where every whim becomes law and anger means death, how does one distinguish fantasy from reality? This psychological landscape set the stage for what followed. Enter Poppaea Sabina. Beautiful beyond description, intelligent enough to match Nero's grandiose vision, ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. She wasn't just another pretty face but a master of political intrigue, with sharp instincts that made her either formidable ally or dangerous enemy. Already married to Octavia in a loveless political arrangement, Nero found in Poppaea everything his wife was not. Where Octavia was quiet and reserved, Poppaea was vivacious and commanding. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea reveled in being the center of everyone's gaze. Most importantly, where Octavia treated Nero like political convenience, Poppaea made him feel divine. What started as typical Roman adultery evolved into dangerous obsession. Nero flew into murderous rages if other men looked at Poppaea too long. He stationed guards around her constantly, ostensibly for protection but really for monitoring. Gifts bankrupted the imperial treasury, jewels from India, silks from China, perfumes from Arabia. He divorced Octavia, alienating supporters and violating tradition. The wedding to Poppaea was unprecedented luxury, but even marriage couldn't satisfy his need for complete possession. He commissioned dozens of portraits, not for public display but private chambers, spending hours simply watching her daily activities. This wasn't romantic devotion. It was someone who confused love with ownership, seeing another human being as beautiful object existing solely for his pleasure. Poppaea understood the dangerous game, intelligent enough to recognize her power, shrewd enough to realize its risks. She used influence to advance family interests while building protective networks. But she had one fatal flaw. She wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero, retaining independence that initially charmed him, but eventually threatened his deteriorating mental state. The day that shattered everything began ordinarily in 65 AD. Poppaea, pregnant with their second child, waited for Nero's return from yet another public performance. When he arrived, she was not pleased. The argument escalated when Papaya dared criticize his priorities, accusing him of caring more about public image than responsibilities as husband and father. Perhaps pregnancy made her feel protected, or maybe she was simply tired of pretending everything was normal. "You're not an artist," she might have said. "You're an emperor, and you're failing at the only job that actually matters." These words, from the woman Nero claimed to love more than life, represented something far more threatening than criticism: the collapse of his beautiful fantasy. In uncontrolled rage, Nero struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Ancient sources describe either a single blow to her abdomen or sustained attack, leaving her bleeding unconscious on marble floors. Picture the moment when Nero realized what he'd done. The man who commanded 30 legions had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. Ancient sources describe pathetic scenes: Nero throwing himself on Papia's body, alternately begging forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if imperial authority extended over death itself. He summoned Rome's best physicians, offering fortunes to save her, threatening torture for failure. But Papia died within hours, taking their unborn child. Something fundamental broke in Nero's mind. Grief wasn't just emotional devastation, it was complete reality break. He refused normal cremation, having her embalmed in elaborate tomb exceeding previous emperors. He declared her divine, established her cult, spent days talking to her corpse. The imperial court navigated even more treacherous landscape, expected to participate in fiction that Papia still lived, referring to her in present tense, leaving her favorite seat empty at banquets. Anyone suggesting moving on faced exile or worse. Most disturbing was how grief reshaped his reality perception. He started seeing Papia everywhere, in servant girls' faces, court ladies' gestures, torch-cast shadows. He'd call out expecting responses, flying into violent rages when none came. During this delusional morning, Sporus entered Nero's sight. The young freedman had worked in imperial household for years, performing administrative duties, staying carefully invisible. Born into slavery, freed as a child, creating loyal servants bound by gratitude and legal obligation, he enjoyed relative privilege, expecting to spend life managing imperial finances. But this privilege came with complete vulnerability. Freedmen owed everything to former masters' generosity, creating absolute dependence on imperial favor with no legal recourse. What made Sporus special wasn't intelligence or skills, it was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree he bore uncanny resemblance to dead Papia, particularly around eyes and delicate bone structure. In a world where Romans believed physical resemblance indicated spiritual connections, this similarity seemed supernatural. When Nero first saw Sporus after Papia's death, he stood transfixed. Here was what appeared to be a younger, more delicate version of his dead wife. The resemblance was so striking that Nero may have believed he was witnessing divine intervention, God's returning his beloved in new form. One obvious problem existed: Sporus was undeniably male. But for a man convinced of his divinity, who spent months talking to corpses expecting responses, changing someone's gender seemed like minor technical challenge. What followed represents calculated cruelty. Nero didn't just decide to force feminine dress. He decided to make transformation permanent and complete. He summoned Rome's best physicians, ordering surgery purely for feminine appearance. This wasn't just mutilation, it was systematic identity destruction. The procedure was dangerous, painful, irreversible, often resulting in death from infection or blood loss. Even if Sporus survived, he'd be forever changed. Physically, emotionally, socially. He'd never father children, experience normal relationships, or be considered fully male by Roman society. Ancient surgical procedures were primitive: bronze or iron knives, cauterization with hot irons, crude antiseptics. The castration would have been excruciating, lasting hours with significant death risk, performed while guards held him down and screams fell on deaf ears. But physical transformation was only beginning. Once recovered, a process taking weeks or months, Nero announced something shocking even jaded Roman aristocracy. He would marry the young man in full imperial ceremony. Sporus faced not just physical identity loss but forced assumption of dead woman's identity he'd never met. Every existence aspect was rewritten to serve one man's delusional fantasy. Transformation preparations consumed enormous resources. Sporus received new name, Sabina, after dead empress, and special quarters for preparation. Imperial seamstresses created entire wardrobes designed to flatter his modified physique and hide masculine characteristics. These weren't just clothes but literal costumes maintaining elaborate fiction. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, many incorporating Popea's own gems, tangible links to the dead woman, physical reminders of whom he was replacing. Psychological preparation proved even more devastating. Makeup artists taught cosmetic techniques to feminize features. Voice coaches modified speech patterns for higher tones and feminine linguistic mannerisms. Most challenging were lessons in feminine behavior: walking, sitting, gesturing appropriately, holding hands, positioning feet, arranging clothing. Can you imagine this psychological torture? Every day Sporus faced mirrors reflecting strangers wearing his face. Every lesson reminded him his original identity was being systematically erased. Every piece of jewelry that once adorned a dead woman became shackles binding him to unchosen roles. The truly horrifying aspect wasn't just physical transformation, it was complete personhood erasure. Sporus was becoming living memorial to someone else, his identity sacrificed to serve imperial delusion. The wedding took place spring 67 AD in the largest palace hall, decorated with imported flowers from across the empire. Thousands of oil lamps cast dancing shadows while musicians played traditional songs. To unknowing observers, it might have looked normal, but those aware understood they witnessed something unprecedented and disturbing. Following the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as legitimate empress. He received his own household staff, luxurious quarters, substantial income, personal litter, finest horses, and supporter retinue whose jobs depended on maintaining fiction. But apparent luxury came with terrible price, complete original identity erasure, and constant psychologically devastating role performance. Sporus accompanied Nero to public functions, sitting beside him at state dinners, playing devoted wife in social interactions. This wasn't about appearances. Nero genuinely believed he'd successfully resurrected Poppaea. He called Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisced about shared memories that never happened, expected responses maintaining elaborate fiction. Every day became high-stakes performance where slightest mistakes meant death. Sporus had to remember not just feminine appearance and behavior, but how to respond as if he were Poppaea herself. When Nero mentioned previous marriage events, Sporus had to react with personal memory. Ancient sources describe Sporus becoming increasingly skilled at deception, developing supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately. But they also note growing withdrawal and melancholy, though he continued perfect public performance. Psychological strain is almost unimaginable. Every morning brought rooms decorated to remind him of dead women he'd never met. Every mirror reflection showed faces bearing no resemblance to original appearance. Every conversation required pretending to be someone else with memories and experiences not his own. When Nero toured Greece in 67 AD, competing in festivals where he believed talents would be appreciated, naturally Sporus accompanied him, displayed to foreign dignitaries as Rome's empress. Greek aristocrats, skilled in diplomacy and terrified of Roman power, played along, but maintaining charades across cultures and languages proved enormous strain. Most disturbing weren't public performances, but private moments when Nero spoke to him as if he were actually Poppaea, recounting intimate relationship details, expecting appropriate emotional and memory responses. Do you remember that morning when we watched sunrise from the palace balcony? Nero might say, you said light reminded you of gold thread woven by gods themselves. Trapped in nightmares, Sporus would respond as if memories were his own. Yes, my beloved. I remember how beautiful you looked in that light. These conversations represent perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspects of Sporus's ordeal. Forced inhabitation of someone else's memories, pretending experiences he'd never had were defining life moments. By 68 AD, Nero's grip crumbled. Theatrical performances alienated aristocracy. Paranoid executions terrified Senate. Governance neglect sparked empire-wide rebellions. When Praetorian Guard declared opposition to continued rule, the writing appeared on walls. Nero's response was characteristically theatrical. Rather than fight or negotiate, he fled Rome with small loyal supporter groups, planning dramatic escape or equally dramatic suicide. Among supporters still dressed in empress robes was Sporus. Imagine the young man's thoughts riding away from the only home he'd known. For over 2 years, he'd been forced to live as someone else, inhabiting identities not his own. Now even false identity was being stripped away as the empire creating it collapsed. They holed up in villas outside Rome, where Nero alternated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical suicide preparations, quoting poetry, practicing dramatic death scenes, famously declaring the world was losing great artists. When word came that enemy forces were closing in, Nero finally chose death over capture, ordering servants to drive blades into his throat. His last words, "What an artist perishes with me." But Nero's death left Sporus incredibly vulnerable. As one of the most visible symbols of Nero's reign, he was both valuable prize and dangerous liability for whoever claimed power next. The young man forced to become empress now faced even more uncertain futures. What followed was perhaps more tragic than previous ordeals. Sporus became political pawn, passed from powerful man to powerful man like valuable property. Each new owner treated him much as Nero had, keeping him dressed as women and calling him Poppeia's name. First claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who helped orchestrate Nero's downfall, but Sabinus's imperial power attempt failed and he was quickly eliminated. Next, Sporus fell to Otho, one contender in the year of 4 emperors. Otho had actually been married to Poppaea before Nero stole her, so his possession of Sporus carried particularly twisted irony, reclaiming not just political power, but artificial recreation of former wives. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before defeat by Vitellius, who became 69 AD's 3rd emperor. Under Vitellius, Sporus's nightmare reached ultimate conclusion. Vitellius was known for cruelty and love of public spectacle. When he acquired Sporus, he saw opportunity to create ultimate entertainment for Roman masses, deciding to use the young man in public Colosseum reenactments of mythological scenes involving sexual violence and humiliation. For Sporus, this represented ultimate degradation. He'd already been forced to sacrifice identity, body, and freedom. Now he was asked to sacrifice dignity before thousands of cheering spectators, becoming entertainment source for people once forced to treat him as empress. Plans called for Sporus to be dressed as Persephone, goddess abducted and raped by Hades. The performance would involve actual sexual assault presented as mythological theater for Romans who had developed appetites for increasingly extreme entertainment forms. But Sporus still had one choice left, the only choice that had ever truly been his own since Nero first laid eyes on him. As the planned spectacle day approached, Sporus made his decision. Rather than submit to final humiliation, he chose to take his own life, probably by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was probably no more than 20 years old. The method he chose, poison, was significant in Roman culture, considered dignified death particularly for aristocratic status. By choosing poison over public humiliation, Sporus made statements about his own worth and dignity, reclaiming autonomy denied him so long. His suicide was both tragedy and final defiance act. After years of forced living as someone else, performing identities not his own, serving fantasies of men who saw him as objects rather than persons, Sporus finally asserted his own will. In death, he refused further degradation. He chose dignity over survival, freedom over continued enslavement. It was the first and last decision he'd been able to make about his own life since Nero's obsession destroyed his original identity. The irony is devastating. Sporus had survived the most psychologically damaging abuse imaginable, endured years of forced identity erasure, adapted to circumstance after circumstance with remarkable resilience. But when faced with ultimate public humiliation prospects, he chose death over degradation. His story should have ended there, with young men finally finding peace after years of unimaginable suffering. But what makes his death even more profound is how it revealed something his tormentors could never destroy: essential humanity. By choosing poison, an honorable death in Roman culture, Sporus was making profound statements. He rejected victim roles forced upon him and asserted rights to determine his own destiny. After years of having every existence aspect controlled by others, he finally made choices entirely his own. His manner of death revealed something: systematic dehumanization had never been able to destroy essential humanity. Despite years of being treated as living dolls and imperial property, Sporus retained enough self-sense to recognize some degradations were worse than death itself. What makes his story poignant is how quickly it was forgotten. Within generations, Sporus's ordeal details faded from popular memory, historians interested in him more as imperial decadence symbols than human beings deserving sympathy or admiration. But Sporus's story survived in fragments, recorded by historians like Tacitus who understood its significance, representing something important about power, nature, and absolute authority's human costs. We're left with stories challenging us to think differently about victimhood and survival. Sporus wasn't just passive imperial cruelty victim. He was active participant in his own survival, someone who adapted to impossible circumstances while somehow maintaining essential humanity. For over 2 years, he performed Poppeia's role with such skill that he convinced not just Nero, but entire imperial courts he was someone he was not. This wasn't just acting, it was psychological survival forms requiring incredible intelligence, adaptability, and emotional resilience. His story illuminates identity, nature itself. Identity, as Sporus demonstrates, is both more fragile and more resilient than we imagine. It can be stripped away by force, but also preserved in ways invisible to oppressors. Throughout ordeals, Sporus maintained something tormentors could never touch: capacity to make moral choices. Even when options were limited to varying submission degrees, he found ways to assert dignity and humanity. His final choice, death over ultimate degradation, was this moral resistance culmination. It wasn't defeat but victory. He refused to let suffering be transformed into entertainment, refused to participate in his own dehumanization, chose to die on his own terms rather than live according to someone else's twisted fantasies. Today, Sporus's story resonates in ways ancient historians could never have imagined. We live in eras where identity questions, bodily autonomy, and psychological manipulation are central to cultural conversations. His experience speaks to anyone ever forced to be someone they're not, who has had identity defined by others rather than themselves. But his story also offers hope, demonstrating human dignity can survive even the most systematic destruction attempts. It shows moral courage can exist in impossible circumstances and proves sometimes the most profound defiance acts are simply refusing to participate in your own degradation. Sporus's name may have been forgotten by history, but his story deserves remembrance, not as curiosity from ancient Rome, but as testament to indomitable human spirits refusing to be completely broken, even by the worst that power and cruelty can inflict. In choosing death over dishonor, Sporus achieved something denied him throughout adult life. He became the author of his own story. His suicide wasn't just escape from suffering, it was declaration that some things are more important than survival, that dignity matters more than life itself. His legacy is one of courage facing impossible odds, humanity preserved despite systematic dehumanization, and individual moral choice power triumphing over institutional cruelty. In worlds where power often seems absolute and resistance seems futile, Sporus reminds us we always retain capacity to choose how we respond to circumstances we face. We may not control what happens to us, but we can control how we meet it. That may be the most important lesson his story teaches us about the enduring power of human dignity.